Welcome to today's session of our lecture series FAU Against CO2. I am Katrin Müller, a law student here at FAU and part of the organizational team, and I have the pleasure to guide us through the evening. Now, one more organizational info before we start. For those of you who will take the exam, the date has now been fixed to the 28th of July from 10 a.m. until 11 a.m. But you will receive an email with more information about this. We are very happy to have Professor Chan here tonight, who will talk about bouncing forward, not back, transformative change for sustainability in a post-pandemic world. Kai Chan is a sustainability scientist whose work straddles social and natural systems with a focus on values and transformative change. He's a professor at the University of British Columbia, a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists, a coordinating lead author of the IPBES Global Assessment, a lead editor for the new journal People and Nature, a member of Canada's Clean 16 for 2020, and co-founder of CoSphere, a community of small planet heroes. As always, we will listen to his lecture for about 60 minutes, and we will have 30 minutes for questions that will be answered afterwards. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions and feel free to give a thumbs up to questions that are of a particular interest to you. We will then start by answering those with a higher ranking, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. I will now hand over to Professor Chan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Catherine and Christina and the other organizers. It's just a real pleasure to be here. The most fun talks that the professor gets to give are the ones where he or she is invited by students. So this is perfect. So today's talk is going to take quite a tour, in a sense, from thinking about COVID and thinking about how that reflects on other broader problems of sustainability. And to start off, we're going to orient around two questions as to how do we chart a positive future from where we are? And then more specifically, what can you do to spark transformative change? The context for COVID is, in terms of sustainability, is multiple. So the first one that you're almost certainly aware of is that COVID-19, or the virus that causes COVID-19, almost certainly came from wildlife. Almost certainly from bats, although potentially by another host, quite likely with the help of conditions in wildlife markets like this wet market, the one in Hunan, in Wuhan, China, where animals are kept in such close quarters, multiple species right beside each other, exchanging bodily fluids in ways that they would almost never do in the wild. That really sets them up to be breeding grounds for diseases. So whether or not the virus actually originated there, it doesn't really matter. The point is that these places are hotspots for risks for viral evolution. And it's not only the live animal markets, it's not only China, it's also the wildlife trade more generally. It's also across multiple continents, here, Africa, also Latin America. These kinds of markets and the wildlife trade in general is absolutely widespread and a major source of pandemic risk. And it's not just the wildlife trade either. It's also climate change and land use change that force these animals out of their usual habitats in order to find habitats that are better suited for climate as it changes, or that are suitable given that we are effectively annihilating much of the vegetation that previously existed in many places. So animals are forced to come out and thereby come into contact with other animals and also with people in a way that brings their diseases into contact with humanity. But the more important point, arguably, in terms of the relationship between COVID-19 and the ecological and climate crises, is actually on the social side, thinking about what we could have done differently in order to prevent this pandemic from arising as a pandemic. It was always going to be a zoonotic disease. I think we really could not, I mean, maybe not, you know, maybe it wasn't even going to be that. But even if it was going to get into humans, it did not need to escape in the way that it did. And if you think about the kinds of things that we could have done differently, well, we could have been so much better prepared. In Canada, we suffered from the SARS outbreak in about 2006. And many of the preparations that we had taken, much of the equipment that we had stockpiled in order to prepare for future pandemics, we just let lapse with the hope that it was never going to happen again. When the pandemic began to arise, we didn't take action early. Almost none of the nations did. Now, of course, this started with China, which suppressed early information about this disease for at least a couple of weeks, actually penalizing whistleblowers who are trying to bring attention to this new disease. But it goes way beyond China to include all of the nations that waited until there was evidence that this disease could be spread by people to other people, and that it had already escaped from Wuhan, China, and from China into our other nations. Canada, for example, did not do anything to prevent travel to Canada from affected regions or to contain community spread until there was evidence that community spread was already happening. That's like deciding that you want to keep the cat in the bag after you've let it out of the bag. In many, many ways, including the long-standing denial of the probability of airborne transmission, the public policy officials and public health officials have continued to deny the science. The science of complex adaptive systems tells us that we ought to be prepared for surprises, that we ought to be prepared for things to be worse than we might like, right? Worse than they appear to be. But at almost every stage with COVID-19, public officials have assumed that the disease is not worse than, say, SARS until we were proven otherwise, or that it was not airborne until basically proven otherwise, and thereby we make mistake after mistake. We continue to do this so as to prevent ourselves from managing this problem adaptively. Even once the world had begun to take COVID-19 seriously, it effectively treated the virus as a static target, assuming that, oh, once we've got a vaccine, we'll be able to beat this because we know what this virus is like, which denies the science of complex adaptive systems and of evolutionary biology, which tells us that once you allow a virus to get into millions and millions of human bodies, it will evolve to become better at what it does. And we've allowed this to happen and allowed these variants of concern to evolve and then escape their initial nations and get all over the world effectively. And this has also stemmed from a lack of integration in our response across departments within nations and across nations. So at every turn, we've seen these failures with COVID-19. But what is most striking here is that every single one of these problems is a primary problem that we identified in the Intergovernmental Panel Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Global Assessment as a problem of sustainability, as a problem that is responsible partly for the ecological and climate crises. So what is that global assessment of IPBES, or IPBES, we call it in a multilingual friendly acronym? If you remember, in early May of 2019, you may have heard news about up to 1 million species that are at risk of extinction due to human activities. It triggered reports like this at BBC and elsewhere, and a swell of media internationally. In the first 3 weeks after the publication of that, of the release of the summary for policymakers, there were over 8,000 sites that covered articles, over 25,000 articles in total, in 49 languages, 164 nations, which reached in aggregate 19.4 billion people, i.e. multiple each person on the planet on average multiple times. Now, this is only for the online reach, doesn't include print media, doesn't include TV, radio, etc. So a massive reach. This assessment was the biggest of its kind. It's unique in a sense in terms of its breadth. Unlike the IPCC assessments, it includes all of the stressors on biodiversity and ecosystem services and the way that nature contributes to lessening climate change and other stressors. It was a 3-year endeavor involving almost 500 world-leading experts. And it contributed to a groundswell of concern about the climate and ecological crises, where the view of this crisis has evolved beyond being seen as just about climate to, as I have been calling it, the climate and ecological crisis. And so in 2019, in the fall, there were rallies all over the world, protests following the Fridays for Future movement that Greta Thunberg initiated. And then, of course, the pandemic hit at the end of 2019 and into the beginning of 2020. And so at this point, I have my own questions for you. Since this is a webinar, I won't be able to see you, but I'd love it if you could just participate anyway from your seats at home and tell me, show if you agree with these various statements. You can put up your hands as many times as you like. It's not just one or the other. So if you want strong climate action, put up your hand. If you want strong action for biodiversity, put up your hand. If you want systemic change to avoid pandemic crises, put up your hand. If you don't believe that we need to choose one or the other, then you should put up your hand. We have effectively been told that we have to choose because the attention that was being devoted to climate and the ecological crises was dissipated somewhat by the pandemic, in part because we were always on our heels in fighting this pandemic, right? That we were not prepared sufficiently that we can continue to push in the same way on these other problems. And that budgets, for example, have been directed towards addressing the pandemic as a crisis. And too few of them have been rethought in a way that would also address the climate and ecological crises. So in this talk, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the IPBES Global Assessment, more than I have so far, giving you a set of highlights of the bad news. And then I'm going to introduce you to the idea of transformative change. And I'm going to take you all the way through to the negotiations that preceded the release of that summary for policymakers. And then I'm going to move towards talking about the role for civic action and for you, and in particular, one initiative that we call CoSphere. I'm just going to pause and take a drink here. So the global assessment is an 1,800-page report, and it had 6 different chapters. If you've heard of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, then you know about the kind of work that is done. This is an official intergovernmental process that commissioned the assessment, unlike the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was just done separately by academics. And the idea was that the Millennium Assessment didn't get the kind of attention that it deserved. And so if we can bring together the nations so that they are actually ready to receive these reports, even asking for this assessment, then perhaps we can be more policy relevant. So this global assessment was following on from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment some 15 years later. First chapter was an introduction. The second chapter was effectively all that was done in the Millennium Assessment, all in one chapter. The status and trends of nature, nature's contributions to people, ecosystem services, and the drivers of change to those. The third chapter took stock of the progress towards and the prognosis for the Aichi targets for biodiversity and the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. The fourth chapter reviewed all what they first called all plausible futures, so all quantitative scenarios and models about the future of nature and nature's contributions to people. And then the fifth chapter followed on from that and recognized that the set of quantitative models and scenarios that chapter 4 reviewed was only a limited set of what we knew about the future, and was too kind of focused on particular problems and also too focused on marginal change rather than transformative change. So chapter 5 then took a backcasting approach and said, what if we actually did achieve a sustainable world, which, by the way, didn't happen in any of the scenarios and models evaluated in chapter 4. What if we actually achieve all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals simultaneously? What does that world look like? Although not necessarily by 2030. What does that world look like, and how do we get there from here? And then chapter 6 was a more focused look at particular policy options, obstacles, and opportunities. Now, I had the pleasure to lead this chapter 5, and I joke that I'm incredibly grateful that I had this privilege, because I think if I'd had to focus on any of the preceding chapters that were just all bad news, I don't know if I would have made it through those 3 years. So I'm going to show you those highlights, and I'm going to spare you in terms of, I'm going to get through it quickly, because the bad news is hard to dwell on, I find. Psychologically, it's just quite daunting. So coming out of chapter 2, nature, this is a snapshot of the picture of how various groups of living organisms are doing now in terms of their threat categories. So the living organisms as the rows, the threat categories as the color bars. Orange and red represent threatened, vulnerable, endangered, etc. What you can see is that up to 25 and more % of major groups of organisms are at risk of extinction. And that's what gave rise to the estimate of 1 million species, acknowledging that many species are actually not even yet known to science, but we can estimate how many of those would be likely at risk based on what we do know. Then looking at these trends across time, we can see that since 1500, there has been a stark and very troubling increase in the percentage of species that have been actually driven to extinction. And then looking at a species survival index, where down is bad in this case, you can see that even on a much more compressed timescale from 1980 onwards, that there is a marked decline in many of these species populations, especially, of course, for corals. This is obviously not just about nature, but also what nature does that benefits us. And so as just one example of that, animals pollinate 91 of 107 leading global crop types. And the value of this contribution, insofar as we can valuate it in economic terms, is somewhere between $235 and $577 billion per year. Obviously, that's a massive underestimate to how much we would be affected if we lost the ability to grow almonds or blueberries or apples or pears or any of these other crops. The trend in terms of these contributions to people, nature's contributions to people, is unfortunately a lot more bad news. So looking across 18 different categories of these contributions and recognizing that there are multiple indicators for many of them, you can see that it's almost all bad news, with a very steep decline or a relatively steep decline in the vast majority of cases, and only 3 cases of a relative increase. And in these rows here for energy and food and feed, this is not actually a representation of the quality or the capacity of ecosystems, but rather of humans' transformation of these ecosystems, because both of these indicators are the % of land that is put into growing crops and biofuels. So not really the kind of good news that we might hope. So then how are we doing in terms of our progress towards the global goals for biodiversity and for the Sustainable Development Goals? The Aichi biodiversity targets actually matured last year, so it won't be any surprise to you now that we did not actually achieve any of them, and we actually made strikingly little progress towards them. I'm not going to say much more about that. Digging into the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the team in this chapter 3 evaluated the extent to which the changes in nature and nature's contributions to people was either supporting or undermining these various UN Sustainable Development Goals. And what they found, unfortunately, was that in most cases, it was either poor or declining or just partial support, meaning that, you know, it's more bad news than good, unfortunately. And there were no cases where nature was improving in a way that was clearly supporting the achievement of these goals, nature or nature's contributions to people. So there's not even a column for that entry as a result. Okay, so that's the bad news. I told you about chapter 4, that what they found was that although there were individual scenarios that showed that you could achieve one goal or another, they didn't find any scenarios that showed that you could achieve multiple of the UN, most of the UN Sustainable Development Goals at the same time. So in chapter 5, we took this challenge and disaggregated it with an idea to put it back together in the form of what we called a nexus analysis. So identifying 6 different goals that were targets of the academic literature on these topics, each of which is, in a sense, a constellation of goals, at least one goal but in recognition of its impacts on others, and all of which are interacting. Okay, let me explain. So the first of these, balancing food provision from the oceans and coasts, also with nature protection. Maintaining climate goals, including by sequestering and storing carbon on land, while still maintaining space for nature and nature's contributions to people. Resourcing growing cities and also maintaining the nature that underpins them. Conserving and restoring nature on land, while enabling that nature also to contribute positively to people's well-being. Feeding humanity from the land, from agriculture, without degrading or taking too much space from nature, and then maintaining fresh water for both nature and people. I mentioned that these different focal areas are each somewhat separate, but they're also interconnected. And so when we undertook the challenge of figuring out what could be done to meet each of these different focal goals, we also then had to attend to the interactions with the other ones. So for example, some of the scenarios that involved feeding nature from terrestrial agriculture without unduly degrading nature on land involved large inputs of both fertilizers and pesticides, which entailed the losses of and a turning over of the soil, all of which entailed the leaching of chemicals and the loss of soils from agricultural areas into freshwater habitats, and also all the way downstream in a way that both degraded water quality while taking a lot of water quantity from human uses and from freshwater biodiversity, and even undermining coral reefs and eelgrass habitats and kelp forests, etc., downstream in the coasts. So how do you do it all together then? Well, we actually had a second part of our analysis in this chapter, which was a set of expert-led literature reviews about cross-cutting key findings, which we then came to call levers and leverage points for sustainability. So these are things that don't just help for the achievement of one of these focal goals, but are actually really important for achieving all of them at the same time. This is what our process looked like, by the way. The team came up with a bunch of initial ideas about these levers and leverage points, which I'll introduce you to very quickly, very soon. We split up 2 separate processes within the chapter, the nexus analysis of scenarios, where we reviewed all of the scenarios and pathway analyses that we could find at every scale globally. And then this set of separate literature reviews that were focused on each of the levers and leverage points. We had constant interaction between them. We had 4 author meetings. We had 4 drafts, each of which was reviewed, 3 externally. And that culminated in this meeting in the plenary in May of 2019. The levers and the leverage points, you may have seen this figure before. The levers and the leverage points represent our idea for the most important, indeed the necessary changes within social, economic, political, etc. systems that can change the indirect drivers, that change the direct drivers that affect biodiversity and what biodiversity does for us. So for a long time, the world's conservation community has paid attention largely to these direct drivers, and not enough attention has been paid to how to change the social systems that give rise to a large amount of land use change and sea use change and too much direct exploitation and climate change and the rest of it. And so this effort was really to dig in to those indirect drivers. So there are some points that are somewhat new here, and there are points that are synthetic across other areas. So in terms of the leverage points, one that you will recognize is not really new, but which interestingly was almost never said in assessments, where if you look at the IPCC assessments, many of them seem to suggest that we can continue consuming at the rate that we have. All that we need to do is to switch to a low carbon intensity. Within the global assessment, we took a starkly different approach and argued that we need to reduce total consumption, which is a function of population size and per capita consumption as well as waste. Now, one of the ways that's only helpful if you have ideas for how you might do that, how you might reduce total consumption and waste. And unfortunately, that's actually a very difficult thing to do. But one of the other leverage points upstream of that was to recognize that a crucial component of consumption is the fact that our whole political system and economic system in many nations is geared upon increases in consumption as measured through the growth of GDP, for example. And that's wrapped up together in our notions of what constitutes a good life, that a good life is one that entails a high level of material consumption. And so if we can change these visions of a good life and also how they're represented in terms of economic and political systems that prioritize economic growth above pretty much everything else, then we can realistically actually take aim at the per capita consumption and waste. All right, there's much more here that I'm going to have time to go into. But I will mention one more of these leverage points, which is about unleashing values in action. Now, many of the authors, interestingly, of the assessment, and many of the reviewers as well, kept on calling for us to recognize the importance, the need for value change. And what we told them after we made a lot of headway into that expert-led literature review was actually that we couldn't find evidence that there was a need to change values, really, but rather a need to unleash values that were already present. Because there are many people agree, for example, and this is coming from some of the research in my lab, actually we'll get to, I believe, many people agree that we have responsibilities for the natural world and have values of care about the natural world and about other people, where the natural world mediates that relationship. And what we really need to do is to find ways to enable people to express those values. So I'm going to come back to that one later. These are the leverage points. We also identified 5 levers at which of governance interventions, which need to be applied both at these leverage points and then also more broadly. And they include the usual suspects in terms of restructuring incentives and also building capacity for action on the ground. And then 3, changing management and governance systems in 3 ways to make them more integrative across agencies, jurisdictions, etc., across sectors, to make them preemptive and precautionary, so that they are geared towards both resilience and, when needed, transformation. And then the 5th one is stronger environmental laws and a stronger rule of law, including transparency in the lawmaking process. Unfortunately, in too many nations, we do not have that kind of consistent enforcement of the law and a transparency so that people understand who is intervening in the lawmaking process, and how the public will sometimes gets perverted. So these levers you might recognize, in particular, these first 3, you might recognize from the beginning of our conversation, and I'm just going to flip back to that slide momentarily, where we were talking about COVID-19, and we talked about the social system failures. And if you remember, they were the same things. I could not have better illustrated the kinds of failures in these governance and management systems with COVID-19 than if I had tried, unfortunately. All right. So that's the levers and the leverage points. The good news is that there are some nations on the planet that have begun to put several of these levers and leverage points together in the form of positive action for the sake of nature. So this includes Namibia with its community-based conservation program, which began with a change in law. Sweden with a whole broad range of initiatives that address pollutants and climate change, and even telecouplings and diverse notions of a good life that go so far as to make their way into the Constitution. Costa Rica, the US with its, and Costa Rica for a whole bunch of things, including forest protection, and again, a right to a healthy environment in the Constitution. The US with its Endangered Species Act, but not necessarily a lot further than that. Seychelles and New Zealand. So I'm not going to say a lot more about those particular nations unless you have questions about them. But the point is that some nations are starting to put some of this together. But to do it at the global scale, and for all of these levers and leverage points, effectively means transformative change toward a global sustainable economy. So this figure lays out one pathway that we scoped out that takes advantage of the ways that these levers and leverage points act together, such that change in one of these levers and leverage points, for example, values and action, can unlock changes in law and policy, in consumption, in technology innovation and investment, and in incentive structures. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of the details on this slide, but we will pull out some of the particular pieces. You might be thinking now that this thinking is really pie in the sky. I don't know if that translates into German, or it's an expression that's well understood over there. But that what we're talking about is so idealistic in relation to the world that we live in. And you might think, how is it that the nations agreed to these statements? So this is actually a figure that comes out of a paper, but all of these levers and leverage points were actually named in the summary for policymakers of the global assessment. And what you might not realize is that the summary for policymakers is actually a document that is reviewed word by word by the plenary, so by the nations that make up IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So 130 odd nations deliberated with us. This is me in a rare moment of smiling on the stage here, as we deliberated this text over a couple of days. These are co-chairs of IPBES, Bob Watson, and of the assessment, Sandra Diaz, Eduardo Brandizio, and then Ingrid Visserin of Chapter 6, etc. On the screen here is a paragraph that gave us no end of trouble, in part because it contained the details about what transformative change towards a global sustainable economy might look like. Although there were other paragraphs that referred to transformative change, there was none that compiled the details of what that would mean for changes in economic and political systems in a way that really had any teeth. This one did. It includes arguing for the need to completely reform incentive structures, including addressing the perverse effects of many production-oriented subsidies. It calls for internationally consistent standards of taxation, enhanced environmental monitoring, multilateral agreements that support those standards of, say, carbon pricing. It calls for changes how we measure economic progress, moving beyond GDP. It also calls for acknowledging the reality of vested interests in political processes that undermine well-intentioned efforts towards such changes. So these are controversial points, and ones that did cause a lot of consternation in the negotiations. And even before we got to the negotiations, such that this paragraph with those details was actually deleted 3 times throughout the process. Once by a nation that will go unnamed, but it was resurrected by other nations that saw the crucial need for a paragraph that provided these details about what actually needs to change to get onto sustainable pathways. So that little story from the negotiation, in the end, by the way, we managed to appease that one nation, which we needed to do because every nation effectively has a veto in these negotiations. We managed to appease them with just changing a few words effectively, but not to substantially change the meaning. This was difficult because of the time difference between that nation's capital and where we were in Paris, because the delegation had to negotiate with the officials back in their home country. So every time we had a new proposed word, we had to send it over to this capital and then receive word, the next morning. This is all for a process that doesn't have any binding targets nor any enforcement mechanisms, right? So it does not even require that anything actually be done about it. And yet it was still so difficult to get serious wording about what should be changed or what appears to be needed to change. And this should give you some sense of the magnitude of the obstacles that we face when we talk about transformative change and achieving sustainable pathways. And so as I and others were sitting in these negotiations, not always up on stage as in this picture, although there were too many hours that were, we started thinking about what we can do to equip civil society actors and interested lay people, thought leaders, to pursue this kind of transformative change for sustainability, given that it was abundantly clear, given the bickering between nations about wording, that nations were not going to just pick up this challenge of remaking their political and economic systems in the name of sustainability and run with it. They needed to be pushed hard by us, effectively. And so what we did was, as a group of authors, separate from IPBES, we had to do it that way because IPBES is a non-advocacy organization. It would have threatened the whole organization if we had identified it directly with IPBES. That's why it's called a citizen's call for a global sustainable economy. We sought to rally the public, and we're still trying to do this. This is not the kind of petition to change one particular law or policy. It's not a petition to save a stranded cat or help somebody who has leukemia. It's a petition to organize ourselves towards the kinds of changes that appear to be necessary across every nation, pretty much, on Earth, in order to achieve this world that we set out to achieve with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're interested, I'd urge you to go to this. It only receives sporadic attention, but we are still monitoring it. We're still collecting the signatures so that we can get back to the people who sign up with some real ideas about how we can actually move towards these changes. So this citizens call argues for implementing all components of the global sustainable economy that I told you a little bit about in that paragraph that did eventually survive, including reining in the power of businesses and overcoming vested interests via enhanced strategic civic and consumer action that's got to be fueled by all of us, which needs to be informed by unbiased distillations of complex, contentious issues about science, and unleashed by new supply chain solutions. As I said, this petition is not towards any particular end. It's really just a beginning in terms of organizing ourselves. Yeah. I've got about 15 minutes left. So let me just taking stock here. Okay, I'm gonna go through this. All right, so what does it mean then for you as individuals? The 5 things that you can do or hold as primary political objectives in all of your voting and civic engagement boil down to 5 different concrete actions. 1 is forcing governments to reform subsidies and incentives, which means making all subsidies and incentives work for rather than against the transformation that's needed. The second is forcing governments to transform decision-making processes so that all decision-making is precautionary, adaptive, inclusive, and integrative across sectors and jurisdictions. This means remaking many of our government agencies. The third is substantially strengthening environmental laws and policies and ensuring that they are able to be introduced in a transparent fashion to weed out the corruption that too often takes place, and then that they will be consistently enforced all across the board. And we need to do this within our nations, and we also need to facilitate those efforts in other nations. Because if one nation takes a really strong stand on this and other nations don't, then polluting industries will simply leave that one good, well-acting nation and go to the other nations that have weaker governance standards. The third is to go carbon neutral as best as you can, as quickly as you can, and do it conspicuously, and incentivize businesses to do the same thing. It is actually already possible to be carbon neutral, although it does require some compromises in the short term via carbon offsets. Now, there's a massive difference between cheap carbon offsets that don't really have any additionality and really high quality carbon offsets. And there is also the danger that some businesses are using these in order to avoid doing the real work that they ought to do. But as individual citizens, we can't actually become carbon neutral yet, but we can make a commitment to doing it in a transitionary way using offsets until we can really truly be carbon neutral. And then finally, the last is to be nature positive. So following the logic of climate change, where we could contribute to the net sequestration of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, at the moment, just like with climate change, where we can't help but emit greenhouse gases through every purchase that we make of a good or a service, with respect to nature, it's the same thing. We can't help but degrade nature and its contributions to people in innumerable ways every time we make a purchase. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we change supply chains such that we can actually contribute positively in net to what nature and what nature does for people, rather than negatively. And so this is a bit of a shift on the logic of nature positive, which through a collection of different nations is being interpreted at the national scale. But arguably, we need to interpret this at the individual scale so that we can live this value, so that we can all embody it in our actions. And if we did all that, it would mean achieving a global sustainable economy. Now, up here in this figure, we've got that central bubble of values and action. So I want to take the last few minutes of my talk to zoom in on that and to really think about what the heck that means and how that might work. I've danced around the issue a little bit already, and now I want to really drill into it. When you think about values in an environmental context, most people think about two different nets of value: intrinsic and instrumental. The intrinsic values being the value in nature that isn't a function of human valuation. And then instrumental value being the pleasure or satisfaction that we derive from nature or from products that are obtained from nature. But these two classes of values, we argued, are actually only representing a really small slice of the ways that people think about nature and why it matters and why they want to do something about it. And so expanding our thinking about values to also include principles, preferences, and virtues about relationships that involve nature, we realize that when I think that a place is important to me, that it contributes to who I am as a person, that individual identity value is a relational value. And it's one that is strongly motivating for many people's efforts to conserve the places that they grew up in or that they live in. And this same value that you can hold as an individual is also held at collective scales, where places can be important to who we are, either as a family or even as a whole people of a society, to our collective identities. And so many of these values, these relational ones, where, for example, also with the stewardship eudaimonic value, where my care for this land fulfills me, it helps me live a good life, that same value can also be understood at the collective scale. And so these classes of values, we argued to get them included in the conceptual framework of IPBES that way back in 2013. And then we realized, shoot, there's no scholarship that actually expresses a single vision for this whole category of values, including not only our individual direct relationships with nature, but also these relationships between people, like my responsibility for impacts that affect you. We'll get to that in a second. So in a paper in 2016, we elaborated this idea and explained what it meant. And that's given rise to a whole bundle of scholarship, as we had hoped, across the social sciences and humanities, where they had already been doing research on these issues, just not with this particular lens of value that enables these considerations to be brought into science policy circles, like with IPBES. So some of the work that we've done in my lab is to understand, don't worry about these particular prompts, by the way, I'll walk you through it, is to understand the extent to which these relational values resonate with people alongside statements of values that you might be much more familiar with, associated with intrinsic or instrumental values. And so we've got a class of relational values here in yellow, which are compared with the ones of instrumental values here in purple. The colors are roughly parallel to this representation of the results across 3 different populations. So here, Costa Rican farmers, here, Amazon users in the northeast of the US, and here, tourists in Costa Rica, international tourists, mostly coming from North America, but some from Europe. And what we found, much to our surprise, because we made the relational value statements strong so that they actually have the potential for leverage, like this one, that humans have a responsibility to account for our own impacts to the environment because they can harm other people. This is a value that can be leveraged into action, potentially, right? It's a strong value, and it's one that if you didn't want to work in this kind of a way, you would arguably say, I don't know. But what we found actually was that there was really broad agreement across all of our populations with this value. So this is a 5-point scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And what we found, interestingly, was that it resonated almost as strongly as the kind of bread and butter clean, which is that it's important to protect nature so that we can have clean air and water, right? Almost everybody strongly agrees with that statement. And similarly, we found that notions of responsibility resonated almost equally with people. And indeed, it was right up there, almost unanimous in terms of strong agreement in this population of Costa Rican farmers. So I want you to imagine a sea change in norms about that value and what that might look like and what that might enable. So let's take these really abstract ideas about values, and let's bring them into the very tangible context of buying stuff. Because that's the context that we have so often been put in, where we're told as individuals that if we want to foster sustainability, we need to buy stuff, right? Buy different things, buy expensive things, usually. And so, for example, with organic, the way that organic certification and other forms of certification work is that you've got a supply chain that exists before organic, right? A mainstream, conventional supply chain. It's usually at least 5 steps long in terms of producers, processors, distributors, retailers, and then us as consumers. And then you've also got this role of marketers, which is always important, it seems. What these certification systems do is they splinter off a small part of that production and then have to keep that separate throughout every step in the supply chain so that we as consumers are buying something different intentionally, which means that we need to know what we're buying and be willing to pay more for it because it almost inevitably costs more. Now, I think that this is one of the things that's different across Europe and North America. I don't think organic stuff costs, the markup on organic is nearly as large in Germany as it is in Canada. But we pay between 50% more and like 3 times more for organic products. And there are a whole bunch of organic products that we can't even get at all, right? Like Halloween. I don't know if how many of you know much about Halloween, this crazy North American holiday where children walk around and beg for candy at their neighbors' doors. Well, you can't find Halloween candy that's organic, right? It just doesn't make sense. So anyway, it's restricting of, it's much more costly. Oh, and the reason for that is not because it costs a lot more to produce, say, organic apples than conventional apples. That's not why. It only costs a little bit more to produce them. And indeed, the costs of production are actually only a tiny fraction of the cost that you pay at retail, right? So what's happening instead is that these products are much more expensive because they have lost the economies of scale, which makes goods cheap in today's markets, right? So conventional apples are cheap because they fly off the shelves. We buy them in, regularly. Almost everybody buys apples almost, every week. They fly off the shelves. The supply chains are thick. Everything is efficient. In North America, organic apples are not the norm. And so it's a much thinner supply chain. The apples sit on the shelves longer. They also get wrinkly, and it requires a whole separate infrastructure. So the inefficiencies mean that these goods cost much more. They also still have impacts, right? Organic is better in many ways, but it's not wholly better, and it's not better in every way. And so to be willing to pay more for them, we have to accept that it's good to be less bad. As I said, restricts our choices in terms of the Halloween candy. And then there's so much complexity about all these labels. There are too many issues. Each issue has multiple labels. The difference between the labels is hard to navigate. For example, on this slide, there are 2 forest product labels, FSC and SFI. They look alike, they sound alike, they kind of, in every way are similar, except in actual substance, they're really quite different, right? And most people can't tell the difference, which means that this cacophony of complexity is preventing most people from joining in, such that it's only true green environmentalists who are participating in these ways, and that most of the rest of the world looks at those of us who go to any length to try to live consistent with sustainability values, and they think, God, that's too hard. It takes too much time and effort. I can't do that. If that's what it takes to be an environmentalist, then I'm not one and I don't want to be one. And that logic stands directly in our path of transformative change, because transformative change is not going to happen as a result of a small fraction of the world's population buying things differently. For most people, maybe they won't even identify as being concerned until they see how they can take action in a feasible way within their lives. So imagine then that you could walk into a grocery store and you could buy seafood that you didn't have to navigate all the different labels and try to figure out how sustainable it was, but that as a transitionary tool, it was net positive in the sense of contributing to fix the various problems that are associated with seafood. So, for example, by installing turtle excluder devices in fishermen's nets, not necessarily the ones that caught whatever seafood you're buying, but in a way that meant that the net bycatch was 0. Might do the same thing in terms of protecting turtle eggs on beaches, or ocean cleanups for stranded plastics. Similarly for beef, for those of you who might still eat beef, kind of the poster child of environmental destruction, and yet it's not necessarily true for all beef that's on the market. And yet, you know, it's really hard for people to navigate this one. But what if all of the environmental impacts could be mitigated on the side? So not only by storing and sequestering carbon, not only in rangelands, also preventing emissions elsewhere, but also the biodiversity impacts that are associated with cattle getting into streams and ripping up the riparian vegetation, which causes sedimentation, and the leaching of pollutants, which causes the eutrophication downstream, etc. All of that could be prevented by fencing those streams and restoring the vegetation, which would have so many positive effects. And in that way, you can imagine that if we had this separate supply chain of virtue, that we could, where all of the supply chains that have residual impacts, which is to say all supply chains, could contribute to mitigating their impacts so that you or I could buy products in a way that is net positive, this could actually conceivably grow the sustainable side so that it changes the whole production system entirely. So think of it like this, and I am wrapping up. I know I'm now a little long. Think of it like this. When farmers switch from conventional to organic, it takes 3 years before they have to take on a whole bunch of costs in order to change their farming system. And there's this period of transition of 3 years before they can sell their products as organic, during which time they are only taking losses. And this is a massive impediment to farmers switching to either organic or, in general, more sustainable methods. But what if instead we could provide some co-payments up front and technical expertise to enable these farmers to switch so that they didn't have to wait for 3 years before they realized the benefit? Then you or I, if we were contributing to these payments through an initiative like Cosphere, could then get the credit, and that's how we could understand our lives to be net positive. And if we could do that, arguably we could switch whole production systems so that organic is not just a viable alternative, and similarly for other sustainability labels, but rather actually the norm and maybe the only game in town. So I've actually only really talked about one kind of value. I'm fascinated by these ideas of values and unlocking the values that we hold, including ones around luxury and leisure. But I'm just gonna move on from that. The point that I want to end on is that what I've talked about is, in a sense, the infrastructure of sustainability. You know, bullet trains are great, but I've never ridden on one, and I don't know when I'll get to ride on one. But we all need a way to enable us to express our deeply held values in a way that we can contribute to the kind of world that we want to live in. And that's where Cosphere comes in, a community of small planet heroes. The logic being that not everyone can be Katniss Everdeen of the Hunger Games, but we all arguably want to play a role in making this a better planet. So with that, I'm going to jump all the way to the end. I'd love you to raise your hands again when you get to points that you agree with. So if you want to go carbon neutral and you want others to join, if you can raise your hands. If you want to have net positive impacts on life on Earth, if you can raise your hands. If you want governments to reform subsidies and incentives, if you can raise your hands. If you want decision-making to be preemptive and adaptive and inclusive and integrative. And if you want strong environmental laws that are introduced without interference from vested interests and then enforced consistently. And if you want it all in the form of transformative change. So we've shown that we can change. The stimulus funding that is coming out now can either prop up the old ways of doing business or they can transform it entirely. So your action, both as a consumer and as a citizen, is needed now more than ever. So we need to act in ways that are intentionally and unabashedly expressing our values in ways that would spark new social norms for transformative change to nourish our planet. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much, Professor Chan, for your very interesting insights. Now, there are quite a few questions in the chat already. I will read them out to you. One first very long question. What are particular, creative, and out-of-the-box ways to be carbon neutral, or things we can do as individuals to become closer to being carbon neutral or not as bad? I am not looking forward for rather obvious ideas, bike instead of car, etc., but would be really grateful to learn more innovative or creative ways.
Okay, so I'm going to, let's see. This is a good question, you know, and it's good that this occupies you. I'm going to tell you a little tiny anecdote, and then I'll give you a bit more of a serious thing. When I was a graduate student, so when I was about your age, probably, we had the task at Princeton, Rob Sokolow of the Climate Wedges paper, tasked us to do an energy budget, energy accounting, greenhouse gas accounting, effectively, for how much energy we expended, and I was looking for creative ways that I could reduce the amount of energy that I spent. So I asked Rob. I said, if I turn off a light that isn't needed and that wouldn't get turned off without me, can I count that as a negative? And Rob said, sure. Yeah, you know, explain your logic, put it in there. So I was late in the office in those days. And at the end of the day, I went around to all the buildings that were in my striking distance. And I turned off the lights that I knew were not needed, right? There were like emergency nighttime lights. And I went around, I turned off all the lights. I figured out how much energy I was saving, and I worked that in. And I was actually, I was carbon neutral in doing that, according to my logic. So anyway, that's an anecdote. Offsets are an important part of the puzzle here, and so I want to encourage you to think about those. Now, as I said, there's a big difference between cheap carbon offsets that come from carbon credit markets that don't really mean anything, but there are direct providers of carbon offsets that are doing really good programs in a range of places. So one of them that I'll mention for you is an American organization, NGO, called Cool Effect. And they have a wide range of different kinds of programs, for example, installing biogas digesters in various places, often in less developed nations where they're not close to having this kind of infrastructure. And so they really are making life better in a range of ways, both locally and then also on at the planetary scale, right? And so, you know, it's still not perfect, right? Because when you emit greenhouse gases, so if you fly somewhere, which I haven't done in a year, but if you fly somewhere, the greenhouse gases get out into the atmosphere immediately. And at the moment, the vast majority of the carbon credits from offsets entail pulling that pollution out of the atmosphere over decades, right? So it's still not perfect at all. And we need to move, you know, we need to do the civic action that forces governments to move towards carbon neutrality. And we need to do that as well as consumers. But in the meantime, I would argue, find a really great source of carbon offsets and then promise yourself that that's a transition tool, but just allow it to give you a price signal. Right, so that when you think about having to fly somewhere, you also remember, you know, you might be able to get the flight covered on a grant, for example, but you won't necessarily get the carbon offset covered, and so that's on you, right? That's just one idea.
Okay, second question. What do you think about private food standards or labels, e.g. fair trade, to make supply chains more sustainable?
Yeah, I don't know whether this question came in before or after I talked about these.
I think it came in before, but
okay.
I still wanted to read it out.
Okay.
Maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, sure. So So I think they're really important, but they do have the effect that I talked about. because they splinter the market, they introduce these inefficiencies. It means that it can only, in most cases, can only work for a niche market, which then becomes a luxury market, which then has the effect of making environmentalism seem like a luxury kind of pastime. And so that's all really pernicious, actually, right? Because, as I said, it impedes transformative change. So what's needed is this transformation, this way of enabling these better supply chains to become normal. And so that's one of the things that we're working towards at Cosphere. You know, because there are lots of good standards out there that are doing good things, but while they are just voluntary and a small portion of the market, they will be inefficient, they will be more costly, they will therefore be luxury, and so they will therefore stand in the way of the broad base of change that we need.
Thank you. Next question, can some restrictions that had to be made under pandemic circumstances be a role model for a policy and means of the sustainability goals?
Yeah, I think in most cases, probably not. You know, in the sense that people are everywhere, almost, are getting tired of these restrictions and are, you know, somewhat resentful about them. Like, I don't know what it's like in Europe, because, as I said, I haven't flown anywhere, so I haven't been on the ground there. But, you know, here in North America, it's like almost every day that there's some protest by a whole bunch of people against the restrictions due to COVID, right? And so I actually don't think that we could ever do the same kind of thing, you know, restricting people's freedoms in the same kind of way for environmental goals as we have for COVID, where for COVID, like, we're arguably protecting their lives, right? Whereas for environmental goals, it's like, it's a bit fuzzier. It's more like we're trying to force them to be more altruistic, you know, in some contexts and in many cases. So I think that it can't be that way. You know, it's got to be, people have to be brought along, right? They have to see that this is something that they want to participate in, and then give so willingly, rather than being forced by government restrictions. Which, you know, I think there's absolutely a place for that, by the way, you know, and for the pandemic, I think, you know, it has worked well in certain contexts. But yeah, I don't think that it's going to be exportable to the environmental context.
Aro would like to know, how possible and realistic is it for an individual or a particular social community to call for environmental changes and enforcements when they are already facing difficulties within their daily needs? I believe it's ultimately a global political and legal step rather than an individual's pursuit. I think you are muted, or is it me?
Thank you. Yeah, I did mute myself. This is a really important consideration that I didn't bring up explicitly in the talk this time. Absolutely, there are many people on the planet that we can't further burden their lives, right? Because they're already so burdened. That said, there are lots of people on the planet that do absolutely have space to take on an extra cost or an extra burden. You know, in North America, people buy so much more than they need in most cases, right? So buying less is not going to impede many North Americans' well-being. And what happens in this vision is that if you have a few people starting to buy things differently in ways that mitigates these effects and also contributes directly to the supply chain transformation, the way that we talked about, then you can have the supply chain shift without the people who can't really help doing anything differently. Now, by the time that the supply chains have shifted so that the things that they are buying are produced differently, then there's going to be an equalization of the increment of costs, which these products will be more costly to buy initially, and the change that comes about, the positive change that comes about from internalizing many of the negative externalities and lessening them, right? So we're actually always paying as taxpayers, for example, to clean up messes that we did not cause. And so, you know, from the perspective of people who can't really afford it, by the time that they are paying anything more, they're also going to be paying less in terms of cleaning up the messes on the back end, right? They're going to be suffering less from the externalities of, you know, living on a slope where logging has taken place up the hill slope that has caused landslides that put their home at risk, right? You know, that from the clearing of wetlands that has put them now into a flood-prone position, such that when heavy rains happen, partly associated with climate change, their home floods and they don't have insurance, right? Like there are all these ways that it will help, internalizing the externalities will balance the books.
Thank you. Rui asks, as a political measure, would it be fair to tax foreign products even more as a way to reduce carbon emissions associated with their transport and maybe reduce the size of the supply chain?
Yeah. So this is an interesting space. I don't know if you have done, if you've looked into like life cycle assessments to figure out, for example, what fraction of the greenhouse gases that are emitted across the life cycle of a product are associated with the transport to a nation. It varies hugely across products, but for many products, that ends up being a pretty small fraction. Now, if it's like an aquarium fish that's being flown, you know, on a Boeing 747 or something like that, then it ends up being, you know, noticeable for sure. But for most things that are coming in a refrigerated container ship or something like that, even if they're coming from overseas, the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with that part of the supply chain are actually minimal, and that it's the emissions that are associated with the production that are actually much more meaningful. So that, for example, if you are in England, there's a famous life cycle assessment that showed that if you are in England and you were forced with choosing between eating domestically produced lamb versus lamb that is coming all the way from New Zealand, right? Half a world away. The better choice from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective is hands down New Zealand lamb, because it is way less greenhouse gas intensive in its production because they are actually eating grass. They're on the rangeland rather than being fed grains that have been produced through industrial agriculture, which entails a massive emission of greenhouse gases. So, you know, I think the better solution is carbon pricing across the board that is in keeping with the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for every product, right? Work it in that way. Don't make it a separate, just taxing imports, because that ends up being a patch solution that doesn't end up helping very much and could be counterproductive in many cases.
Thank you. Paul writes, thank you for the inspiring lecture. Wouldn't it mean to avoid any kind of luxury goods to be personally sustainable? Isn't our system itself responsible for each of these bad news? I personally think that for each of our technical developments, we pay a price. Wouldn't it be necessary to go back to nature and go farming if we would like to achieve that goals? I just wonder how much we can claim for others to act and how much I have to go for myself.
If you want to go and practice truly sustainable agriculture, I would wholly support that. Perennial polycultures that involve a diversity of species, including long-lived species, that maintain the structure of roots and canopy that supports a diversity of wildlife and also occasional farm animals, can be massively more sustainable than the existing agricultural systems and actually regenerative of soils and of animal populations. So, you know, go for it. That would be awesome. That said, there are other ways that we can contribute to changing these systems, and you can't do everything. Right? Like there's a massive need for folks who are trained as lawyers to help to, you know, to bring forth suits that are in line with this vision of sustainability. There's a massive need for policymakers and for people in business and for, you know, people in the academy and in engineering and etc. Right? All across the board. So don't sweat what you can't do. You know, find your passions, find where you can contribute most of all, because there's honestly there's not a sector within society that is not relevant for this transformation.
One more question. I recently came across the concept of tragedy of the commons. It is astonishing how humans behave if a good of people try to gain advantage in a short-term basis. How to fight that?
So Garrett Hardin is the author of paper 1968 or something, I can't remember, in Science that was about the tragedy of the commons. This paper has been, in a sense, debunked. The paper appeared to many to be arguing that this tragedy of the commons was inevitable, that people would inevitably act in their short-term interests and thereby undermine collective goods. The reality is, as Elinor Ostrom pointed out, and I would say that Garrett Hardin did leave the door open for this, although many people don't give him any credit for that. The reality is that actually lots of systems do not operate that way because people find a way to cooperate. And so, you know, and so Elinor Ostrom won her Nobel Prize effectively for showing how that arises in a range of different cases. And the truth is that if you have a population of people that have enough things in common and including a common interest in, say, a resource or a system, then and they can express their values that are consistent with that, then you can absolutely have sustainable solutions emerge. And I would argue that's what we need to do, right? Even at the global scale, we need to be acting in accordance with our values in a way that supports everybody doing that, and where we work for that better world unabashedly, right? Without feeling embarrassed about doing that. And at the moment, it's just, you know, our efforts are just so piecemeal. And they're so divided, they're so consumer oriented in a way that doesn't ultimately help. That most of the people who are most active for sustainability and environmental protection are focused mostly on those consumer actions that, as I argued, have that negative effect of making it seem so difficult and costly and so luxury. Right. So we need to change these systems. We need to change the norms, and it is possible if we work together.
Next question. What could be an alternative to the GDP?
GDP is a measure of basically economic output. And as such, it has a purpose. It is not, however, a good measure of economic progress. And unfortunately, it is too frequently used as that. right? It's not a good measure of progress, period, including the progress within the economy. So there are a couple of different ways that we could proceed, and they can complement each other. One is to improve measures of GDP so that they're inclusive of other forms of wealth. And this would include unpaid labor, where a part of how politicians have been artificially boosting GDP and measures of economic growth is basically to take whole sectors of unpaid labor and to move them into the economy, right? So that, for example, women join the workforce, which then requires that other people come in and take care of their children. And the economy counts both the women joining the workforce as well as the other people taking care of their children in a way that makes it look like we've got a lot of progress. When it's yes, that does represent some progress. It depends on what the jobs are, but it's massively overestimated in terms of GDP as a measure of that, right? So inclusive wealth has to account for that kind of incorporation of unpaid labor. It also, and both by humans as well as by ecosystems, right? So to the extent that we degrade ecosystem services in selling products, or producing and selling products, we need to be accounting for that as a deficit on our accounts. And at the moment, that's not a mainstream thing to do, although we've made plenty of progress in terms of knowing how to do it. So that's one part that we arguably need to do. Another part is to recognize that even that is not going to do a very good job of representing people's well-being. And there are great measures of that are being developed about subjective well-being in terms of how satisfied we are with our lives. Now, those can be improved as well, but in multiple ways. But arguably, the combination of much better economic measures of genuine progress and then also subjective measures of well-being improved can much better represent how we're doing.
Thank you. Now, one last question. What is the most important change a politician should do?
It would depend on the politician, really. Politics is a messy business. Depend on all kinds of things, right? Depend on if they have a position in cabinet. It depends on whether they're part of the governing party, So that's a hard one for me to provide a single answer for. I mean, I guess I would say the most important thing is to pledge to work in every facet towards a global sustainable economy and to take the fight everywhere, to fight against continued fossil fuel subsidies and agricultural subsidies that don't actually internalize the negative effects of that production, to work for more transparent lawmaking and consistent enforcement of laws. And it's like it's everything. I'm gonna choose the cheating answer and say, my wish is to have more wishes.
That's okay. Thank you so much, Professor Chan, for your detailed answers, and sorry for everyone whose answers we haven't answered now, whose questions we haven't answered now. It was an honor to have you here tonight, Professor Chan. Thank you to our audience as well. We will upload today's recorded version in our FAU portal. As always, it can take some time. Feel free to give us feedback via mail, write us who you would like to hear in our next lecture series and on what topic. Next week, we will welcome Professor Phoebe Kuntudi from Athens, and he will talk about the economic case for a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. We hope to see you again, everyone. Have a nice weekend and bye.